my name is Greg Asner. I'm with the Center for Global Discovery and Conservation Science. I'm here on the beautiful South Kona coast of the Big Island of Hawaii, and today I'm joined by Bryant Grady also from the Center for Global Discovery and Conservation Science. Welcome, Bryant.
Thank you for having me, Greg. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you down here on the seafloor, somebody with your experience, someone to share your knowledge today and your experiences here in Hawaii and elsewhere. Before we get started, I just want to ask you a few questions. How long have you been working here in Hawaii?
So I've been here in Hawaii for about 6 years now. I've been working in West Hawaii on this coastline, working with fish and corals for about 4 or 5 years. And I've dove most of the coastline and looking at a variety of different types of ecology here, specifically looking at coral reef ecology to see how corals are interacting with the environment around them.
Awesome. Well, we got a lot to unpack there. But before we go any further, what's your favorite thing about these reefs here in West Hawaii?
One of my favorite things right here is these corals that we're seeing right here. These are amazing creatures, and they're creating the environment that's around them. And they are the foundation for everything else that we see. So I love to see nice, healthy reefs, and a lot of them all around us.
I really like the fact that you look at the coral as generating the habitat. Yep. Without the coral, you don't really have a coral reef.
Exactly.
So, okay, one of the big things that I'm really curious about today is coral disease. And I know that that's one of your specialties among many. In terms of coral disease, I mean, I think of coral as, you know, this thing on the seafloor. How does it get a disease? What is a disease? And what does it really do to these corals?
Exactly. So corals are really complex creatures. So the actual coral animal is not just comprised of just the coral. When we think about a coral, we have to look at not just the animal, but the symbiotic algae within it, and also the entire microbiome that exists within the coral. So all kinds of different algae, bacteria, all of these things are making up each one of these coral colonies. And so when one of those kind of gets disrupted, it will actually influence the entire colony itself. And so that's what can cause diseases. And when we see disturbances like things like temperature or nutrients coming into the system, it can disrupt one of those three things, and that can cause diseases to become present on reefs.
Wow, so coral disease sounds pretty complicated. We got these three factors: the animal, the algae, the microbiome. And it sounds like the research that you're doing is trying to figure out not only, you know, what's causing the disease, but where it's popping up. Tell us about how it works on the reef. Like, give us some sense of the big picture.
So one of the things that we're seeing in particular, and one of the things that I focus on, is how each individual colony has a disease and how that relates to the colony around it. So when we're looking at, let's say, this particular colony in general, I'm looking at to see if this colony next to it and the other colonies that are surrounding them also have diseases. Corals, because of their complexity in the actual animal, it's hard to figure out what the actual disease is within a colony. So we don't know what the disease is, but we can generally find out the ramifications or what the cause or the damage the disease does to the coral. And if we can see that this coral here has a disease and it's spreading from coral to coral, we can assume that there's some type of agent moving through the colonies.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like, yeah, almost like a virus moving around.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, when you think about coral disease, I mean, there's that kind that spreads around. But how does it really even get here in the first place? Do we know, or is it still kind of a mystery?
It is still kind of a mystery. But we think that there are these three major vectors of disease transfer on a reef. And diseases underwater obviously are much more complicated than you would see diseases on land. Because we have this water medium where if we have diseases on a coral here, they can travel via the water easily to corals over here. And so waterborne transference of diseases is one of the major concerns that lots of people have on coral reefs. One of the other ways we're seeing issues in disease spread on reefs is called vectorborne transmission. And this is where things like fish are moving diseases from one colony to adjacent colonies farther down the reef. We're having something pick up a part of a coral that's diseased and then move that disease elsewhere. So vector transmission is very common as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. So we have vector transmission. We have this kind of patchwork of disease that can break out. Do we know the role of, say, in other environmental factors like ocean temperature or how much light there is? Is there work on that, or is that also part of the mystery?
So that's there's a little bit of both on that. So there is previous work on that, and this really goes into that when disturbances come into the system, when we see things like heat waves, when we see things like storm damage or eutrophication from excess nutrients. These are disrupting those microbiomes within a coral, and that will cause outbreaks of diseases.
So coral disease is really complicated. I mean, you've got this animal, you've got this algae that's living with the animal, you've got this thing called the microbiome. It's like CSI kind of work, where you're trying to figure out where this disease is really taking hold in any of those three factors or those three components. Is that right?
Yeah, you can definitely get components of disease in all three of those things. It's very complicated to pinpoint the exact type of diseases because of it's called the plasticity of corals. Each individual coral colony can be different from the colony that is next to it, even if it's the same species, and even if it's in the same environment. We can see that the microbiome for this coral, let's say, is going to be different from the microbiome of this coral.
I see.
Because of that, we'll get different responses to diseases and different things in the environment.
So each coral has its own kind of relationship to the diseases that it might get. And that could be because the animal does, or something about this relationship it's having with the algae. It could be so many factors. Now, when you're swimming along a reef here, how do you identify a diseased coral? What do you see that makes it go, okay, that one's got a problem?
Well, Greg, let me show you what some of the diseases are. So if we're just looking at these corals that are right here, we can see, if we're looking at this one here in particular, you can see how there's this discoloration that we're seeing, and it's this different pigmented color. It's different from this original yellow or greenish tones that we're seeing. And so what we're seeing is there's a number of different responses that we're going to get. We can either get this grayish color that we're seeing in the coral on top, or if we're looking at some corals that are over here, we can see that there's a pigmentation response occurring here, where we get this pink color tones that's occurring where the corals are actually fluorescing due to some type of disturbance. And so it's really the best way to look for diseases. It's knowing the different types of diseases or health conditions that are present on a given reef, and then looking at each individual colony to determine what's there. And it's almost like giving the individual colony a doctor's visit.
Wow.
And so we do that for every colony on a reef to determine the overall health of a reef system.
So you're like an underwater doctor, cruising around trying to figure out who's sick and what do we do about it.
Yeah, it's definitely something like that, Greg.
Okay, so you read about, places like Florida where there's a lot of coral disease, and at the same time you read about the same places, sometimes they have pollution and other things that are affecting these reefs. Is there a relationship between whether a coral gets a disease and what we're doing on land?
There's definitely a relationship between that. What we do on land a lot of the times directly impacts what's happening to corals underwater. When we see different types of runoffs, when we see different types of anthropogenic chemicals or human-made chemicals coming into the environment, these are going to disrupt the different types of coral reefs we're seeing, and it's going to introduce these new chemicals that are being introduced are going to cause disruptions in the coral's biology, and we can see these disease outbreaks start to occur. It's very difficult to actually decide what's causing the certain diseases, but what we can link a lot of these to is human effluent that's coming from these sources like cesspools or sewage leaks. And when they come into reef environments, they do tend to cause disease outbreaks or disruptions in healthy coral reef systems.
Pretty amazing. When you swim along the west side of Hawaii Island, do you bump into a lot of disease, or is it kind of sporadic? What's it like diving and seeing these and looking for these diseases?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is that diseases have some type of spatial structure. And it's not everywhere along the coastline, But when we tend to see diseases, we tend to see more of it in one area. There's less distribution and more clustering occurring than we previously thought. And this is some of the new things that we're just starting to find out about the coral reef habitats and coral reef ecosystems along West Hawaii in particular. So making sure we can see large areas of coastline, that we can map large areas of coastline, is really critical in determining the amount of disease, the prevalence, and the structure that we're seeing along this coast.
Wow. I don't know, when I swim along, I kind of try to look for all the good things on the reef, but I think I might start looking for diseases too. Thanks for this. I really appreciate your time. It's been really good having you here in the Coral Classroom, and I'll see you on the reef.
Thanks for having me, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, take care.